It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour MP Angela Eagle, Executive Editor at HuffPost UK Paul Waugh, and the businessman and author Richard Walker. Today...
Can you tell us a bit about the day you were asked to become Chancellor?
No, gosh.
The Chancellor's definitely getting noticed with this video ahead of the budget. Has he got a plan to save the high street? Richard runs a major supermarket chain. He'll tell us what he thinks is needed. You've probably heard politicians talking about this.
It is right that we've had the uplift to UC. That is a lifeline.
This £20 uplift has been the difference between making ends meet or not.
But what about the millions who haven't been moved onto universal credit? And is Donald Trump planning to have another go?
Who knows? I may even decide to beat them for a third time.
Let's start with a little bit more of the video released by the Treasury last night. You saw a little clip there of Rishi Sunak. This, of course, ahead of the Chancellor's budget speech tomorrow. Let's have a look a bit more.
At the heart of this budget will be honesty and fairness, honesty about our situation, both in the short term, where we're still grappling with coronavirus and we want to keep providing support, but also honesty about our long term, with the exciting opportunities we have to drive new growth across the country. You know, all of that will be in the budget.
Well, Rishi Sunak starring there in that video. Paul, it's actually 6 minutes long. Have you ever seen anything quite like that from a British politician?
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, the cult of Rishi expands more every week. You've got the personally branded tweets to the Instagram. You've got the signature on all of that. He's got these in-conversation videos of people like Gordon Ramsay. He's even got his own email and weekly newsletter. It's not as much fun as mine, I have to point out. But the whole point of this, obviously, is it's about him appearing eloquent, reasonable. It's about a different kind of conservative so that Labour can't say, look, this is the nasty party. That's all the upside. The downside is the sort of cringe factor and also, more importantly, a serious point, which is, you know, it's the sort of David Brent thing. I've got my dream job, but sorry, you're losing yours. You know, that's the real danger in all this stuff. And, you know, the very image of him holding up the budget box in his own room and twirling around with it, it looked like a sort of political equivalent of a teenager singing with a hairbrush in the mirror, didn't it?
Don't hold back, Paul. Laura, what did you think? Did it make you cringe or did you think, oh, how refreshing?
I actually thought it was. I thought it was a fair film because in the kind of cycle of immediate news and social media, it's sometimes quite easy to forget where we were a year ago. And you know, he says at the top of his piece that usually it's completely it'd be very atypical for a new chancellor to have 3 weeks to prepare a budget, let alone put together a package of support just a couple of weeks later that would support 13 million jobs. And you know, I think it has been an extraordinary, unprecedented year. Words like furlough weren't even part of our lexicon, 12 months ago. So I thought it was reasonable that he at least sort of took stock of the 12 months that he's been asked to handle.
Okay, reasonable, but was it about the budget or about him?
I thought it was about the budget, but I thought it was about perhaps contextualising some of the decisions he's been required to make. It's not going to be an ordinary budget. You know, we already know that there is a sense of continuing some of the emergency measures, but also for the first time, I think, setting out what the landscape that lies ahead will look like in terms of job creation, in terms of new investment, in terms of the direction of the country.
Yeah. I mean, Angela, there's nothing wrong with communicating with the public in what was a very sleek video.
I thought it was self-congratulatory. I thought it was self-regarding propaganda. So it was cringe-making, but also
you watched it.
Oh, well, I got through most of it because it's my job, but I don't think most people will get to the end. I mean, let's face it, you wouldn't have thought that our economy was 10% smaller, that investment was plummeting, that we've had the biggest hit of any developed country, that 122,000 people have died in that year that he's talking about. I wouldn't put my name to something like that if I'd have been presided over that.
Laura?
Well, I don't think you can lay all of that at the Chancellor's door. It's a once-in-a-century global pandemic. And one of the things I thought the video did quite effectively is it continued this sense of an ongoing conversation that he's had with the British people. And I think you've seen that from all the politicians at the top, from the Prime Minister and probably from the Health Secretary too. We don't normally have 5 p.m. press conferences several times a week. We don't normally kind of hear from the top people at government. Normally, in fact, Conservative governments try and keep out of people's lives a bit. So there has been this sense of a direct conversation which has lasted most of the last 12 months. And I think it was fair, given that this is his big showpiece statement of the year, that he sort of, in a way, drew together some of the strands that he'd been working on in his first year. It is just his first year as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
All right, Richard, from your point of view as a sort of marketing exercise, what did you make of it?
Well, from a marketing exercise, I'd say he almost looked prime ministerial. So I don't know if he's out on manoeuvres. Look, I get it. I think obviously the Tories are very keen to PR the extent to which they have tried to support British families through the pandemic. But of course, given the sensitivities of the job losses, the growing inequality, and just how hard it's been for many people, I think it does come across quite self-indulgent, and also looks quite expensive as well.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the substance in the budget, or what we're expecting in the budget tomorrow, because this headline in The Telegraph from former Conservative Foreign Secretary William Hague: time to cast aside the dangerous illusion that tax increases can wait. This is in response to the debate that has been raging in the media and amongst politicians over the last week, to tax or not. Now, just like Pitt in 1797, he says the government needs to raise taxes to prove that its debt burden is sustainable. Is he right, Laura?
I think that he probably is right. I don't know what the Chancellor's going to do, but my impression from talking to my own constituents is that they're pretty realistic about what's happened, the level of public spending, about the extent of the emergency exercise, and about what lies ahead. And I think people expect, particularly the Conservative government, they expect fiscal responsibility. They don't want their grandchildren to travel with debt in generations to come. I think they may, there would be differences amongst the public about the nature and extent and the timing of tax rises, but people don't want us to borrow indefinitely. They don't want central banks to keep on printing money. But I think there's also quite a desire to move away from austerity, and that's something you haven't heard from the Prime Minister at all. So in those circumstances, it's right, I think, that the Chancellor will be thinking about some form of tax increase.
Angela?
Well, this is about timing, I think. Firstly, we've still got the pandemic with us, and what I want to see from the Chancellor tomorrow is good indications that he will continue to support those businesses and people that have been stopped from working, going about their daily business because of the health emergency. So that's the pandemic bit of the budget. Then there's got to be a recovery bit of the budget, and that's about a fiscal stimulus to help the economy wake up properly from the induced coma it's been put in because of the health pandemic, and get it going properly, to save jobs that are viable if you can just keep them going for a bit longer, to get the economy up to speed. And then, of course, you've got to look to see what you can do to fill the hole of borrowing that supporting the economy in the last year has created, because this is a government now that has taken our national debt to 100% of GDP. So there has to be some consolidation, as the economists call it, to start paying some of that back. But it's a timing issue, and it's also a fairness issue. How do you do it? You make sure the people with the broadest shoulders have bear the biggest burden of that. And you've also, during the fiscal stimulus part, you've got to make sure you get the money in the pockets of the many rather than the few, so they will spend it and get our economy motoring again.
Right. Just to be clear, perhaps with both of you, Laura, are you saying that you agree with William Hague because you'd actually like to see the Chancellor set out tax rises now, starting in the sort of near future, or setting a direction of travel for the future in the way I think Angela is saying?
Well, I'm not sure I understood what Angela was saying, actually. She seemed to be saying that we should continue emergency measures, which I think everybody accepts, that we should continue to support households and those who've borne the brunt, which I think everybody accepts, and that at some point in the future we should look at tax increases. What I think is that we need to be absolutely realistic with the British people, that this does have to be paid for. And I think that, look, I don't know what the Chancellor's going to do, but if there is an announcement of tax increases tomorrow, I wouldn't be surprised. And as long, of course, as it's meted out and applied in a way that's fair and that the British people understand as a fair reflection of paying back that debt, then of course I would support it.
Angela?
Look, let's see what the Chancellor announced in his so-called winter economic plan last year that didn't last out November. He took £14 billion out of the economy in increases which were mandated to council tax, a 5% increase, which will take money out of the pockets of the many. He also announced a key worker pay freeze, which will mean that the spending that people have is actually reduced in real terms. And he didn't announce tax rises, but he took spending out of the economy. You cannot get an economy going again without actually ensuring that people have money to spend at the beginning. It's a Keynesian argument about stimulating the economy, not cutting off the recovery, not needlessly destroying jobs, which are then much more expensive to recreate. It's about saving businesses that are viable now. And if he gets the timing wrong on that, he will do the same kind of damage that George Osborne did when he cut too early and got us into a double-dip recession earlier in the century.
All right, Laura, do you want to respond and then I'll open it up to the others?
Just briefly to come back on that, it wasn't a key worker pay freeze in the spending review. It was a public sector pay freeze, but he took out of that frontline NHS staff who did not have their pay frozen. And I just want to say that all the way through the year, the Chancellor's priority has been about protecting jobs. First, it was about supporting them through the furlough and the self-employed income support scheme that secured 13 million jobs. And everything since then has been about stimulating the creation of high quality jobs through the Levelling Up Fund, through the infrastructure projects that have been announced, through the traineeship and apprenticeship programmes that have been trailed as part of the forthcoming budget. So the idea that we're sort of using tax levers in order to choke off the recovery is the absolute antithesis, I think, of everything that the Treasury is working on. And I don't even know what's in the budget, but I do know what the kind of the focus and the main themes and the priorities of the Chancellor are going to be, and it's going to be about jobs and livelihoods.
All right, Richard, listening to this debate, should it be tax rises now or later?
I think the sooner the better. I mean, I understand the argument that we don't want to choke off the recovery, but I'm also very concerned at anyone who thinks we can simply rely on rates being low forever, or we'll just grow our way out of it. Certainly as a business, we'd never submit any business plan or produce any cash flow that just lazily assumed we'd grow our way out of trouble. And the Chancellor must now balance fiscal responsibility with, of course, the continued ongoing obligation to community support. So I do think the sooner he gets on with that, the better. And it probably is time to change some of those old ideologies because of the radical times that we find ourselves in. And I think we should be looking at the big levers that are available to us to try and raise as much tax as possible. And it's quite simple, really. There's only a few of them: income tax, corporation tax, etc.
Right.
And I agree with the concept that those with the broadest shoulders should pay their fair share to support the many.
Right, and you'll know that there's a triple lock, and we can obviously debate on another occasion as to whether the government should stick to that. Former Chancellor Ken Clarke said not, and that is about not raising the headline rates of income tax that you've just talked about. But on the issue of corporation tax, people who agree with you, Richard, are in the Labour Party. I'll just show everybody this story in BBC Politics. Sir Keir Starmer's critics in Labour become increasingly vocal, and they include John Trickett, Ian Lavery and Richard Bergen, three former shadow cabinet members quite recently, calling for Labour to back a rise in corporation tax and that Keir Starmer needs to be bolder. Should there be a rise in corporation tax backed by Labour, Angela?
Well, certainly, again, it's a timing issue. I certainly wouldn't do it this year when you're just trying to get the economy out of deep freeze. But what I would say is that we've had historically low levels of corporation tax in this country, and that you could certainly, as the Treasury Select Committee, which is an all-party committee, said in its report published on Monday, you could certainly put corporation tax rates up without doing too much damage. But it's a timing issue, as I was saying earlier.
Right.
You've got to ensure that you've got the economy properly working again. You don't want to destroy businesses.
Right, so those guys are wrong. You think the three of them are wrong calling for it now on the basis, as they would say, to actually tax and get money from companies that have done rather well and profited?
Well, that's a different issue. The issue of how you fairly tax businesses once the economy is back to normal,
right.
It's a completely different issue. And what I've just said is that there certainly is room for corporation tax rises in the future, and we're expecting the Chancellor to announce them. It's just a timing issue.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, and you've said that, and I can hear the emphasis. I can hear the emphasis in the timing. Paul, you wrote about this last night. Has there been a shift in position by Labour? Are they finessing their sort of stance on what Keir Starmer said? There shouldn't be any tax rises at all in this budget. And also in your mind, the three that I talked about. I mean, how important are they as critics to Keir Starmer?
Well, I think you can safely assume that Keir Starmer isn't that upset by people like Richard Burgon criticising him, because particularly last night, I mean, there's a Zoom meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party where most MPs gave Keir Starmer and Annalisa Dodds their overwhelming support for this strategy. But as Angela just pointed out, you know, the timing is everything. Keir Starmer himself said over the course of the recovery, tax rises are wrong. Now, that begs the question, when will the recovery be, you know, when will it get started, the actual recovery? When will it be finished? And when will we, as Angela said, go, quotes, back to normal? Now, that might not be next year. It might be the year after. Who knows? And it depends how you define that. I think the real difficulty for them is that actually they seem to be, at the moment, appearing as though they're going to just repeat what the government says. And I think for a lot of Labour supporters, that's difficult. Don't forget, however, Labour comes from a very different place on this. It wants to tell the voters that Labour has changed under Starmer rather than under Jeremy Corbyn. And they want to repeat a little bit of that Gordon Brown stuff from, you know, Labour in opposition in the 90s when they were talking about Ken Clarke's 22 Tory tax rises. You know, Labour tried to neutralise that whole big tax bombshell issue in the 90s relatively successfully. And I think that's what Starmer's trying to do again.
All right. I think there might be a slight problem with the microphone, Paul. I think we can just hear the tapping, but I think somebody will talk to you. Don't worry. We're going to actually look at what has been confirmed, perhaps slightly unwittingly, by the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, in terms of what is coming in the budget, and that's the extension to the furlough scheme. Let's have a listen.
I think the Chancellor has already indicated that we will be extending furlough. I think that's been part of a public announcement. I think there'll be other measures that we'll see tomorrow. And it used to be the case that, you know, budgets weren't divulged that often. I'm not prepared to go into particular details, particularly as the Chancellor is going to be introducing his budget tomorrow.
Right thing to do then, as Kwasi Kwarteng said, extend the furlough, as it sounds like it's going to be announced. Laura?
Well, I don't know if that is the case or not. I've only heard it from Kwasi's interview this morning, but I think it's not a surprise that there's going to be an ongoing package of what I would call emergency support. And if the furlough extension is part of that, I get it's not a surprise, because we know from the Prime Minister's roadmap that we're really looking at another 4 months before it's anticipated that everything will be open. And even when it is, there'll be a number of businesses that take some time to get going. So I would expect some ongoing support, either in terms of wages, or I think we know there's going to be a number of different business grants given to hospitality, retail, leisure. And I think that's absolutely critical, actually, to giving some of these businesses, which are now, I have to say, a year in, some of them are really, really struggling, just talking to the businesses in my constituency.
All right, well, we're expecting, of course, also some sort of rescue package for the High Street, which has been extremely hard hit. Richard, should the business rates holiday be extended?
Potentially, yes, for those businesses that need it. And I think there is a much wider issue on business rates, a systemic issue that the Chancellor needs to get a grip on. And that is the undisputed fact that regardless of this particular moment,
yes,
business rates more than anything else are destroying our high streets. And probably the biggest reason of all why we're seeing the slow, undisputed decline of the high street. So we need to look at how we can replace that 30 billion odd pounds of funding for local government that business rates currently pulls in, and redistribute that potentially to maybe an online sales tax for online retailers, and just balance that playing field, because business rates are a historic Victorian outdated tax on bricks and mortar retailers. And actually what we need is a fiscal system that is fit for the 21st century and takes account fully of online sales, which of course in this country have gone through the roof in the pandemic. And at the moment, the likes of Amazon, etc., don't fully pay their fair share.
Right. I mean, Paul, do you think we are expecting some sort of windfall tax to be announced on those companies that have done well during the pandemic?
I think what's more likely is that, as with a lot of things in this budget, it'll be a holding statement. It may not be coming in straight away. It might be a sort of direction of travel that is going to revisit later in the year. I suspect that's what we're going to get. I mean, don't forget, for both parties politically, the demise of the high street is a long-term thing. It's been accelerated by the pandemic, obviously. But, the sight of boarded up high streets and shops, they're in wealthy places now as well as poorer places. It's a very visible symbol of decline. And I think politically, that's really difficult if you're in government. Very, very difficult indeed. It's the sort of modern equivalent of, derelict factories popping up. But we in the news industry are more than aware of the havoc that the digital industry can wreak on an industry. So I think, they're just going to have to learn what's happened in news and roll with some of the technology, adapt it when they can use it, and maybe retain some of the traditional methods as well.
Richard?
If I could just come in there, I think it's true. It is definitely a long-term issue that's been around far before COVID, and that's why we need to look at the full response. If the next general election voters want to feel like the government has done anything for them, it's about their immediate sense of place, their civic pride, and their sense of community, and that's why the whole high street decline argument, the business rates argument, is more important than high street jobs, even though that's very important. And a lot of jobs have been lost in the high street over recent years. It's also about people's sense of community. And I think that's why the high streets are so important. So we don't just need to look at taxation system. We need to look at freeing up the sclerotic planning system so that it's easier to convert redundant premises into places where people actually want to live as well as work. And potentially looking at trading hours as well. Amazon can trade 24/7, 7 days a week, whenever they like, and yet we're still bound by really quite restrictive laws, especially on a Sunday. So again, it's about coming up with a whole suite of policies that mean that we can properly invest in our high streets.
Right. Well, I mean, that is the wholesale approach that you are promoting there, looking at the issue of business rates and beyond. But Angela, if we look at the issue of this windfall tax on those companies that have done well, and many have, is it as simple as that? Putting a tax on them, making them pay up now?
Well, it wouldn't be. I suspect what has been talked about, which I don't necessarily disagree with, is actually a retail sales tax of some kind that would be applied equally. And it's clear that business rates have to be looked at, and that's currently a lot of revenues. You've got to look at those things in one go, and you've got to see how you can reform the tax system so that it's fit for the 21st century rather than quite backward looking, which it is at the moment. You have to ensure that you protect the tax base so that your tax base doesn't disappear and your revenues disappear as technology and digital delivery systems replace the high street. So any chancellor would be looking at that. And from what I hear from the myriad of leaks that we've had in the last few days, there's going to be what's known as a tax day. He seems to be separating out taxation from his budget statement and having a tax day of presumably a blitz of consultations on how to take the tax system forward towards the end of this month. We'll have to wait and see what he says.
Yeah.
But the need for reform is obvious.
Laura?
Well, I mean, just going back to your original question, Joe, I think We've already heard a bit of the kind of direct financial support that's going to be provided to high street businesses in the form of grants. I agree with your previous speakers that we do need to have a long-term conversation about the high street. And I read with interest, actually, the story in The Sun this morning about the Community Ownership Fund, where people will be given grants so that they can buy their local pub, their village shop, their local football club. And I thought that was really important, because sometimes we talk about the high street, it's so broad brush, and we forget about the things that give people a sense of identity and pride, and the things that make the difference between loving where they live or feeling dislocated. And those things are exactly it. I know how much they matter to a rural constituency like mine. So I think that, I hope, is the kind of spirit that we'll see more of in the budget and in the months and years ahead.
All right, I just want to draw everyone's attention to this headline in The Guardian on the story Tesco and Morrisons to repay £850 million of COVID business rates relief. Supermarkets faced mounting criticism after sales boost, albeit with higher costs. This is obviously the support that they have enjoyed from the government. Richard, you're the Managing Director of Iceland. You've made the decision not to pay back the support that you've had. Why not?
Well, to state the obvious, the pandemic is far from over, and we'll see where we end up. Look, we lost £70 million last year. We'll lose money again this year. I make no apology for using public money to protect jobs, which is what it's about. Through this pandemic, we've undoubtedly been lucky in that we've been allowed to stay open, but we haven't taken any dividends or anything like that. We have invested heavily in our stores and our staff. We've created over 5,000 new jobs. We've given a special bonus to everyone, and we've continued to donate to good causes throughout, as have many others. So I make no apology for that, and I think it does go to show that, you know, each individual business case is different and has its own set of circumstances. But if we're projecting jobs, creating jobs, that's what these things are for.
Angela, do you have some sympathy with that? It's not just Iceland, also the John Lewis Partnership, Co-op and M&S aren't paying back the relief they've had. It's less than Tesco's, which received 585 million, Morrisons 274 million. By comparison, Iceland, the figure we had is 40 million. Do you sympathise with Richard's argument, or should they pay it back?
I'm not going to get into a big argument about that. The Chancellor made it available. I think it's important to remember that these stores are actually ensuring that people get fed, and they've helped us keep going. But I also think it's an issue of size too. About £1 in every £4 spent in the UK is spent in Tesco's, and so perhaps they have broader shoulders, and they've calculated that they can afford to pay it back. I just think that so long as these things are out in the open, people can make their own decision about their attitude to the stores that they shop in.
All right. Richard, I mean, do you think...
Yeah.
Go on.
I think that's right. And I've always tried to be open and transparent about where we stand on this. But, cajoling, if we'd have been told it was a loan, we would have acted differently. And I believe we've made the right decisions for the long term of the business. But I noted last week, Asda have said that 5,000 jobs are going to be put on notice. And yet they also pay back £360 million of business rates relief in January. So I think we've got to be very careful about how this money is used and paying it back too quickly, when what we're trying to do is protect jobs.
Right. I mean, are you saying that you are going to pay it back at some stage, or no, that's been ruled out for Iceland?
No, I didn't. No, I mean, like I said, we've lost money, and we're not in a position to do so. I'm just saying, as Angela was, it's about each business should be taken on its own account. OK, well, thank you for clarifying it.
Now, in March last year, you may remember that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, introduced a £20 a week increase in payments to those 6 million people on universal credit. Now, he's under pressure to continue with that increase from the opposition and within his own party. And every time we do have a discussion about the universal credit increase, about how long that extra payment should stay in place, we have emails from viewers who have said that it actually doesn't go to people who are still on what the government calls legacy benefits, the old system of benefits. And that actually amounts to around 2 million people. One of them is Michelle, and she joins us from Norfolk. Michelle, what's your situation?
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Yes, I'm a single parent and I'm a disabled person, and I have 2 children. I've been a single parent for quite some time. And yes, I was completely unaware of the uplift payment. It was only brought to my attention partway through the scheme, because it did not apply to me as a disabled person at that point. I was not entitled to it.
And is that because you are on the old sort of style of benefits? You're not on universal credit?
Yes, I was put onto the old style of benefits pre-pandemic, which in itself has changed very little. And obviously, I haven't had the opportunity to change now to entitle myself to that £20 uplift.
Can you give us an idea of what difference that £20 extra a week would make to your life?
Absolutely, yes. I'm a mum of 2, and I find that £20 sounds like a very small amount, but it's actually quite considerable when you consider the circumstances that a lot of people live in. £20 is getting on for half of my food budget with an almost teenage boy. As you can probably imagine, food is
eats a lot. Yeah.
Yes, and on top of that, there are other expenses such as the heating. I suffer from arthritis, so the cold can actually make things much worse for me. Myself and my son are both asthmatic, so we need to keep the heating on to keep the damp down. And on top of that, expenses for the children as well, because it's not just the claimant who is affected by this £20 uplift. It is the people around them. And for myself, it's my children, it's those people who are affected. My son, for example, cannot wear regular off-the-peg high school shoes because he has very wide feet. £20 buys me one shoe, one school shoe. So that shows you just how much it's needed.
Well, Michelle, thank you for spelling out exactly what it would do and the difference it would make having that increased payment. Now, we did try and call the Work and Pensions Department. They couldn't provide anyone for interview, but they have said in a statement that people should move on to universal credit. So someone like you should move on to the single benefit payment. What do you say to that?
I'm afraid this can has been kicked down the road for far too long. I became a single parent 7 years ago with the breakdown of my marriage. My daughter was a baby at the time. And every year at the job centre, they would assure me that this would be the year I would go onto universal credit, and that I was to save money from my benefits to cover a period of what was at the time 6 weeks with zero income.
Yes.
Now currently 5 weeks, which is longer than most people have to wait for their wages. And so every year I've been promised that I would be moved onto universul credit.
And it hasn't happened.
Year it hasn't happened.
Okay.
Now I contacted my own MP and I asked her, what could be done? And she contacted Treasury herself. And the party line was, if I would like to receive the uplift, I must volunteer to go onto universal credit. And in order to do that, I should endure the 5-week wait with zero income with 2 dependent children.
Yes.
As a responsible mother, I cannot do that.
All right,
I cannot possibly do that.
Let's put that to Laura. Michelle, thank you very much for explaining your situation. Laura, listening to that, what's your view? Shouldn't that payment have gone to people like Michelle?
Well, yes, and I was obviously trying to work out, listening carefully to what Michelle was saying, and also about her life with her 2 children. I used to be a lawyer before I was an MP, and I worked with some claimants who were migrating onto universal credit. And all I can say is that from the minute the universal credit scheme came in, it was always going to be a gradual kind of migration process. And I believe that's still the case with the last people due to enrol by 2022. So there's about a year to go. I'm very sorry to hear about Michelle's circumstances, but I would just make the point that the government was aware that not everybody was on universal credit. And that's why they did things like they added another £1,000 last year to working tax credits. And also throughout the country, and I can only talk about my constituency specifically, but there was the COVID Winter Grant Fund. Yeah. We got about $250,000 from central government that went to the local authority, and that was to support families that sort of fell outside the support systems that had been put in place, and that was to help with things like heating costs, food, white goods that could be replaced. And I directed quite a lot of my constituents there for several months, and they were getting really good support through the local authority. So look, I know it's been said and it can sound like a line, but we have done everything we can to sort of wrap our arms around the country. And actually, we have tried to think as creatively as possible about people who may not qualify for one form of benefit or another. But yes, I do believe that we're getting close to the end of the rollout process for universal credit.
All right. Paul, listening to both Michelle and Laura, what do you think the government will do?
Well, it seems as though Rishi Sunak is going to extend universal credit, certainly for the main benefit of universal credit. The question is just for how long. I suspect he will be smart enough to realise, look, I've got to neutralise this issue and I've got to extend it for at least 6 or 7 months until the next autumn statement, whenever that is. That might be October, maybe November. That buys people time to cope, just to see how the summer pans out. Because don't forget, the most important thing to remember here is a lot of people are going to be expected to be made unemployed this year. On the OBR's own forecast, it's going to be 2024 until employment reaches pre-pandemic levels. That's a long way away. So a lot of people for the first time in their lives are going to go on universal credit. They've never been on a benefit before, and they're going to be a bit surprised, shall we say, what they find, particularly if they're told that they're going to lose this extra £20 that other people have had. So politically, it's really important. But I think Therese Coffey, the Work and Pensions Secretary, seems to have won the internal battle in Whitehall to make sure it's not a one-off payment and to make sure it's longer than, say, 3 months. All right, well, we're going to find out, of course, more detail tomorrow in the budget. Don't forget to join us on Politics Live from 11:15 for PMQs and the budget that follows from Rishi Sunak. Right, we are going to move on and talk to Nick Bryant, the BBC's New York correspondent, who has a book out called When America Stopped Being Great. Nick, the book title is striking. When did America stop being great?
Joe, it is great to be here. Thank you for having me on. America stopped being great on June the 17th, 1968. No, I'm just kidding. That's actually my birthday. This book actually, thank you very much. This actually, rather than pinpointing a specific moment, it looks at a period of history, a 50-year period of history, where this country went from being the United States of America to the disunited States of America. It tells the story of how the decline of America paved the way for the rise of Donald Trump. And Joe, it begins with my personal American journey. I arrived here in 1984 on my own, on the eve of the Los Angeles Olympics. And I experienced this extraordinary modern-day gold rush. After the long national nightmare of Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis, America got its mojo back by dominating the medals table in Los Angeles. Of course, later that year, Ronald Reagan went on to win re-election in a landslide. He won 49 out of 50 states with that ringing slogan, "It's morning again in America." And the book tries to explain how we went from "It's morning again in America" to the American carnage of Donald Trump's inaugural address, the mass mourning that we have tragically seen during the coronavirus outbreak, and of course, that dramatic event where the book ends.
All right.
The storming of the Capitol on January the 6th.
Right, but what are the key trends, though, over that long period that you identify then?
Look, we often regard Donald Trump as a political phenomenon, but really he was not just that, he was an economic phenomenon. So many people felt like economic castaways in a globalized economy and a digitized economy. Bill Clinton said he built a bridge to the 21st century, but that bridge bypassed so much of America, so much of the Rust Belt. Donald Trump was a cultural phenomenon. Donald Trump was a racial phenomenon. So many people hated the idea of having an African-American president, and they went with the guy who'd been the leader of the birther movement, the guy that had denied that Barack Obama was even American. We have seen the technological developments contribute to the rise of Donald Trump. Okay. You know, Twitter and Facebook placed in his hands these weapons. And Donald Trump's often seen as a perfect storm, but that's the wrong analogy because, Joe, storms pass. And this is a permanent weather system now, this state of disunion.
All right, well, let me bring in the others, because, Laura, you worked for Hillary Clinton when she was a senator. Do you recognise some of the trends that Nick has talked about over that period?
I think I do, actually. I think that, I mean, obviously my sort of experience starts from the beginning of this century, but some of the trends that led to Donald Trump were probably just getting started at that point. So there was the George W. Bush was in the White House, and some of the neocon movement was definitely beginning this link between being a Republican and being a true patriot in the aftermath of 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then that sort of shape shifted a bit into the Tea Party movement, particularly after Sarah Palin's vice presidential bid. And then that kind of evolved again. And all the way through that, I think there was a kind of increasing polarization among some Republican states. And I think in some ways the same thing was happening with the Democrats, where there was room for more of an insurgent candidate in 2016 in the form of Bernie Sanders, who was kind of asking American people, do the Democrats speak for you? Some of them, fly around in private jets and hang out with movie stars. Is this really the true sort of spirit of the Democratic Party? And he started something on the other side that was, I think much more powerful and effective than people first expected when he first declared his candidacy.
Well, Nick, if we then come right up to date, most people would agree that America is divided. And President Biden says he wants to heal the nation. He wants to bring the country together. He signed a whole series of executive orders, including the Paris Climate Change Agreement, rejoining it, ending construction of the US-Mexico border wall, and putting forward an Equality Act to protect transgender rights. Does that do that? Does that bring the country together, those sorts of things?
We've spoken, Joe, for this century about a post-American world. I fear at the moment we are living in a post-America America. It's certainly unrecognisable from the country that I saw as a 16-year-old in Los Angeles. And polarisation now has become so endemic. And this is Joe Biden's mission impossible. He presents himself as the healer of this country.
Right, but do those things do that? Do those things do that, or are they divisive, some of those executive orders?
Joe, the problem with America right now is that everything in America is divisive. Potentially unifying events like the coronavirus outbreak end up being accelerants of polarization. Something as simple as a face mask becomes a divisive political symbol. So something like the Equality Act, which is trying to update the 1964 Civil Rights Act and grant rights to LGBTQ. That is polarizing. When it passed the House, it just attracted the support of 3 Republicans. It won't get the Republican support in the Senate that it needs to become law. Everything is politicized in America right now. Everything becomes a political fight. In the 1950s, we had patriotic bipartisanship. Okay. Republicans and Democrats came together to pass big legislation. That simply doesn't happen anymore.
Angela?
Well, I think that what we see here is the politics of divide and rule, post-truth, the big lie. And I actually think that the real reason for all of this, culture wars aside, is that we're in both the UK and in the USA, we're running economies that aren't working for the vast majority of people. More and more people are struggling. And what we've got to do, I think, is look at the economic model. If you're going to be a unifying figure, you've got to look at how the economy delivers for the majority of people, and you've got to take care of those people that lose those systems. Without that, the politics of division and hate and grievance will continue to fester.
All right. Richard?
Yeah, I think the really positive thing about Biden, obviously, is rejoining the Paris Agreement, and hopefully that will unleash a tidal wave of positive green action and investment across the planet. And he also frames it perfectly because he says, when you talk about climate, I think about jobs. And I think we talked about the budget earlier and what the government stands for and reducing inequality. We need to create a jobs first green future.
All right, Paul, just very briefly, you literally got about 20 seconds.
I think that what's fascinating is that Trump is now bigger than his party, and that will be really interesting in the next few years. Very few political leaders are bigger than their own party. Look at Margaret Thatcher, but Trump certainly is bigger than the Republicans.
All right, and on that note, thank you very much, and thank you to Nick for joining us from New York. We'll be back tomorrow at 11:15. Bye-bye.